Hi, I'm Sandeep, and you're watching the Indian Weekender. Today, we are in conversation with a politician who is a leader of a political party, and shall I say, is probably the only leader other than the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern at the moment, whose political stocks have been consistently rising in the last few months, at least ever since COVID-19 virus had hit upon us and turned our world upside down. He's a leader of a minor political party that was languishing at around 0.5% votes on the election night in 2017, with only one member of parliament in parliament. But come 31st July, in the last One News Colmar Bunton polls, the party has risen to a hopping 5% votes, which, if repeated on the election night on this 17th October, could very well get anywhere around 6 to 8 MPs in the parliament, thus making him one of the most significant allies of the opposition National Party. So, this party leader is also singularly and, shall I say, emotionally involved in the end of life choice bill or act, on which we all are going to do a referendum along with the general elections. So, yes, you have guessed it right. We are talking about ACT Party leader David Seymour. So, welcome to our virtual studio, David. How are you today?
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me on Indian Weekend, Sandeep. It's great to talk to you. And look, I'm good if you consider everything that's going on. We've got a lot to be thankful for, but a lot of areas where we could be doing a lot better too.
Surely, and David, today we are quite keen to talk all about that. We know that you have been very vocal, and definitely you have been attracting a lot of traction, I would say, within all segments of New Zealanders. But as David, you would know that we have been planning to get to our studio here in Auckland right since 31st of July, when actually the last polls returned your party at a whopping 5%. But things have changed, as you have rightly pointed out. Now we are in the middle of second wave of coronavirus in New Zealand, and so I cannot afford not to start straight away with your mood, your thoughts, particularly what happened yesterday with Prime Minister coming out and announcing the extension of lockdown in Auckland and in the alert level status of rest of New Zealand. So how exactly you were feeling?
Well, look, frustrated like a lot of people, Sandeep. I mean, it's a shame that we can't do this interview in person, but that's nothing compared with the inconvenience and I think more importantly, the uncertainty that a lot of people are feeling. In hospitality in particular, but a lot of people in retail, a lot of people in the food business, unable to operate or at least not operate at full capacity and make money. So we've got enormous difficulties right across the economy as a result of this lockdown. And let me say, I'm in favour of the elimination of COVID 19. I don't think we should open up and let it rip. But I advocate, and the ACT Party advocates, a well-being approach where we consider all of the impacts. So it's kids losing their learning opportunities, a lot of anxiety with kids in the run-up to high-stakes exams. It's small business owners with real, stress and anxiety because they just don't know when their business can open. And it's people going into hospital for scans and elective surgeries, having that cancelled. And then it's money. People say, oh, lives are worth more than money. Well, I agree. But just remember the cost of this lockdown in Auckland alone is $1 billion, depending on whose estimates you go by. Also, $1 billion is the entire Farm Act budget. So once you take a well-being approach, you say, we can't afford to keep doing these lockdowns. So you asked how I feel. I'm frustrated because for months, ACT was saying we need to get a lot smarter. We need to get smarter at contact tracing. We need to be like Taiwan. But the government didn't do it. And so when this first outbreak happened, they said, okay, lockdown for 3 days, we'll try and get on top of it. They didn't. Then they said, lockdown for 2 weeks, then we'll get on top of it. They didn't. Now they're saying, oh, just another 4 days, we'll hopefully be on top of it soon. The truth is that we haven't invested during the good times to be ready to trace an outbreak. And I think the outbreaks got ahead of the government. and that's why the only thing they have left is to fight COVID are these lockdowns that are so damaging to well-being. So, look, frustrated that we didn't get more prepared for this earlier.
Well, sure. Thanks for sharing your views, David. But I would say that you have touched upon many issues and probably we would like to talk a little bit in detail. So, you have saved me one question when you say that you are in support of elimination strategy, because probably that is where that you in the position probably making a lot more sense when you are very clear on that. Otherwise, what we have heard from a lot of other political parties that they are also yo-yoing between their support and criticism of the elimination strategy. Well, that takes me to the next question. When you talk about your well-being approach, which is again an innovative one, we haven't heard this word apart from obviously Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's use of that word for the budget. So, can you explain us a little bit more, like how your well-being approach that you are proposing would be compatible with the elimination strategy?
Sure. So the government talked about well-being with its 2018 budget, and they did that budget, but I didn't see how it was different from any other budget the government's done. It basically said we're going to tax a group of people over here, and we're going to spend the money over here, and that's what every budget does. Um, I don't think they were serious about it, and they haven't been serious about well-being when it's come to battling COVID-19. So what they should have been saying is, look, this lockdown was devastating. It hurt the economy. It hurt people's well-being. We need to do better next time. And how can we do better? Well, we've got to get better technology like Taiwan has, so that we can make elimination affordable. That is without lockdowns. You can't look at the economic cost, the amount of money being borrowed. You can't look at the mental health costs. You can't look at the student learning costs. You can't look at all the non-COVID healthcare that's being missed out and say, gee, our strategy should just be to have another lockdown. We can't afford these continuing lockdowns, not just because the lockdowns are expensive, but because of the uncertainty for people in business. Who would invest in a restaurant right now? You just have no idea if you'll be able to open next week. So, taking a well-being approach would have counted all the other costs, not just COVID-19, and said we need to invest. And I look at Sam Morgan's COVID card. I'm not necessarily saying that's the answer, but it would have been $100 million to give one to every New Zealander. If we'd done that, we would probably have traced this outbreak and be back at work by now. Even if it only had a 10% chance of working, it would still pay for itself because what we've got now is $1 billion cost. I'd rather spend 100 million on 10% odds than take $1 billion hit. Now, I think it would have been a lot more likely than 10% to work. I think it would have been a good investment. But the government spent those 102 days doing victory laps. And here's the other thing they do: they always compare us with the worst. So the Prime Minister gets up and says, "You be glad you're not Victoria." Well, actually, we should be comparing ourselves with the best. We should be asking, what about Western Australia, South Australia, Queensland, even New South Wales? There's all these states in Australia doing quite well, but we don't compare ourselves with the best and try to improve. This government just wants to compare us with the worst and tell us to be grateful, and I just don't think that's good enough.
Sure. Well, that's quite a valid argument, I would say, David, when you say that we need to compare with the best. But coming back to your comparison with Taiwan, probably you have been speaking a bit lately more about comparison and being inspired by Taiwan. So, do you think it's a fair comparison, given that Taiwan has a history of dealing with these deadly pandemics at least for last 2 decades? The command control system that you would have said somewhere else that government should be creating that was created in 2009 when actually they dealt with swine flu pandemic, that was H1N1 influenza, and they had learnings from dealing the SARS outbreak in 2003. So they have a robust experience of dealing with pandemic of at least last 2 decades before they actually excelled and nailed it this time. And unlike New Zealand did not have that kind of horrible experience in the past, and that's why probably they were caught on the wrong foot this time. So do you think it's a fair comparison and we need to give a little bit of benefit of doubt to this government for scrambling their way and trying to manage this crisis?
Well, I actually think it's a very unfair comparison. It's unfair on Taiwan. I mean, this is a country smaller than the North Island, with 23 million people living on top of each other. You know, they've got 40 times more people per square kilometer than we do. They're right next to China. They have, you know, hundreds of flights going backwards and forwards, even flights direct to Wuhan, and yet they did better than us. Now, you're absolutely correct in your point that they had SARS, they had, you know, bird flu, they had swine flu, they had dengue, they had a lot of opportunity from 2003 onwards to prepare. And so I think you're right. It would be unfair to make a comparison between New Zealand and Taiwan in March. You know, we weren't ready. No Western country was ready. But my criticism is, okay, we accept that. What about the last 4 months? Because the government had that 102 days of COVID freedom. And I was saying, look, send the best people we've got to Taiwan, get an Air Force jet, send them up there and tell them to find out what's going on, and the government didn't do it. So that's my criticism is not that they weren't ready in March. My criticism is that they weren't ready in August, September.
Well, that's great. I would say, and probably your criticism, that is your smart criticism, shall I say, is responsible for your the increase in votes that you have seen probably in last few months. Because probably you are making a lot more sense these days. Now, coming to your well-being thing that you have already explained, but this well-being approach, probably from what I'm trying to infer, what you're suggesting is trying to bring a lot of cooperation between different organizations and then probably an overseeing from top of the government. Is that something that you are envisaging or suggesting?
Well, it's exactly right. And, you know, again, I don't want to go on about Taiwan, but they really are the best and we have to learn from them. Just remember, Taiwan had 7 deaths. On a per head of population basis, they had 12 times fewer deaths than we did. And they had no lockdowns. So when someone does that well, you've got to start you know, asking how have they done better. And you know, to your point, yes, they had a central epidemic command center, and they brought together all of the government departments and the private sector. So everybody genuinely worked together to achieve an outcome. And it's not just me saying this. You know, you look at Professor Des Gorman and Murray Horn, that they're piece in the New Zealand Medical Journal on, I think, Friday morning, saying exactly the same thing. You need to get a multidisciplinary task force that is accountable to government. So the government sets clear objectives for this organization, such as keep COVID out, avoid lockdowns wherever possible, and then give them the resources to get on with it. At the moment, it's very difficult to know who's in charge. And the Prime Minister always says when something goes wrong, she says, oh, we don't want to allocate blame. Well, come on.
Right. Okay. Well, again, coming back to this task force that you were saying, or your other allies in the position, what they're saying is that this COVID response of this government should be made apolitical, to which Prime Minister has already kind of rejected that. So basically, don't you think what they are doing right now by bringing in multiple agencies, be it border agency like Ministry of Health, and then bringing in housing minister, and then of course armed forces as well, they are also trying to scramble, I would say, their way to reach to a stage where multiple agencies are already working. It might not be I would say, well refined as probably those in opposition and those who are not tasked with dealing with the pandemic on the ground would like it to be. But don't you think we are eventually getting there and would get there at some stage?
First of all, I think you're right that there are multiple agencies involved now. But I just point out that they seem to be making it up as they go. And I think we need real leadership that this is the overall goal and strategy of New Zealand. These are the people we require to realise it, and we're putting them in place with a clear mandate and lines of accountability now. The other thing I'd say is that you're right. I mean, the Minister of Housing and the Air Force are involved in the border, and the Ministry of Health is involved with contact tracing, and then presumably PPE. Where's the private sector? You know, the solutions, and again in Taiwan, that they got the private sector to work carefully with the public sector. So this is not just about bringing in different government agencies, they've done that sort of almost by accident because they make up a new solution each time something goes wrong. It's about saying, these are our objectives. This is who is involved. This is what you must achieve, and this is who you're accountable to. Nobody's ever explained that, and that's why I think we have a real problem with trust and a real problem with accountability and results.
Sure, and as we know that you are a great champion of the private sector, and that for the benefit of our Kiwi Indian audiences, ACT Party is always for private sector. So you rightly say that you need to see a strong role for private sector in the public health pandemic things. But again, this is a question of I would say ideological divide, because right now those who are in the government, who are on the center left, probably they have lesser amount of trust on private sector, and as you have pointed out earlier, that they will rather borrow the experience from Victorian experience, where probably private sector's participation was hailed as being responsible for the second wave of resurgence over there. So, but just to clarify, like what kind of role you envisage for the private sector, in what capacity they can be involved in the decision making in the response to this COVID-19 situation?
When we released our well-being approach, we put five principles. The first one we talked about, the Central Epidemic Command Center, like they have in Taiwan. But the second one was that the government should be a referee rather than a player. So the government should set really clear rules of the game and then make sure the rules are followed. So the way I would look at it is that in Victoria, the problem wasn't that they had private sector security guards. The problem was that there appears to have been bad hiring practices or bad procurement and contracting practices between the government and the private sector. So that's a problem of execution rather than the overall strategy. But second of all, in New Zealand and in Victoria, no matter who's actually performing the duty, nobody was being the referee. So the government wasn't setting the rules of the game and enforcing them. The government was trying to do the job and hold itself accountable. And that's why we found that actually most people weren't being tested, even though the government said that they were being tested. It turns out they weren't. So my view is that the government has to be the referee. It has to set the rules of the game, and then it can say, look, if you follow these rules, then you can isolate at a private residence or a private hotel like they can in Taiwan. But that means that you've got to have the technology to monitor people. I'm talking about, smart watches that measure your heartbeat and look for reductions in heart rate that indicate you may have a virus and track you using GPS. I'm talking about using digital cameras or thermal cameras at airports to single out people who have a temperature. I'm talking about using big data to identify people who have tested, negative for influenza and still recorded a temperature recently after coming back from overseas. So these are all the kinds of things that government needs to do: is use really good data, really good monitoring and enforcement to set the rules of the game. Then you can let the private sector get on with the job.
Sure. And since you have talked about government being a referee, I'm pretty sure that we need to get you in our studio and have a detailed conversation, because that's more an ideological point of view. Where we will definitely love to have you in the studio and discuss more about that, because a lot of people these days who probably might not agree with your ideology, your party's ideology, they might want to see government more as a manager who is managing the public health pandemic, rather than seeing it as a game and playing a role of referee. But again, it's open to discussion, I would say. Now, coming back to the point that you are saying, that increased use of technology and doing the monitoring and enforcement, don't you think that here in New Zealand probably there might be more repulsion, as it will be considered as an invasion of privacy and leaking of data? Do you think we will have that kind of appetite here in New Zealand?
Look, I think that these are very challenging issues. How to respect people's privacy and autonomy and fight the virus effectively. So, right now, the answer is, well, we're going to make everyone stay home for 3 weeks and destroy businesses. I think there are ways that you can use data and electronic monitoring and respect privacy. So if you look at the COVID card proposition, um, with COVID card, you actually have a card that stores data for only 21 days, and the data is anonymous. So you only get your data accessed if you become infected. And then it's only the name and phone number, so you can quickly call people who have been involved um, in contact that you've been in contact with. So that's an example of how we can do really good monitoring, really good contact tracing, but the data is only stored for 21 days and it's all anonymous. So I think it's possible to work through these challenges, and I think it's really important that liberal democracies like New Zealand manage to be better than authoritarian countries at managing COVID, because this is a turning point for the world. Will liberal democracies that have the rule of law and individual rights be better at fighting COVID than authoritarian regimes? And right now, who's doing the best? Well, it's Taiwan, it's South Korea, it's Singapore, it's New Zealand, it's Australia, and most states. It's the democratic countries, but close behind them is China. You go back to India, I think they're having some real challenges, and it's so critical that democracy thrives in India. So I'm really focused on how we can do more effective fighting of COVID while also maintaining our freedom and democracy. And I do think that is possible if we have an intelligent conversation.
Well, sure, and I would say that that is definitely a good point of discussion. I would say you are dealing with an important point here for our societies, more for our democracies, and that will require another detailed sit down or maybe more regular sit down with us, and we are more than happy to do that. We
We're
might
getting
want to
some good
move.
topics here.
Surely, surely. We are already setting up for the next round of interview, and I'm pretty sure that I'm coming to that question very quickly regarding to our elections. But before I let you go more on this COVID-19, government's response to COVID-19, if you have to give this government score on a scale of 10 for its COVID-19 pandemic management so far, 0 being the worst and 10 being perfect, where would you rate this government so far?
Or I'd give them a six probably. I think that they have done well to keep COVID out of New Zealand. But remember, we're an island. It's one of the easiest places in the world to keep COVID out of. The reason I wouldn't give them a seven or an eight or a nine or a 10 is that there's been huge economic costs, and it didn't have to be this way. If we'd been smarter, if they'd used the time they had to get more intelligent responses, we could all be better off from a well-being approach. So a six for doing okay, but we could do so much better to get a seven or an eight or a nine or a 10.
Sure, definitely. Now, on that same scale, if I ask you to rate your bigger ally in opposition, National Party, I understand that they have got no role in managing this COVID-19 crisis, but if you have to measure their contribution in throwing the ideas in the mix that can be used for managing COVID, how will you like to rate them?
Oh, look, I think there's really sort of three phases. So the Simon Bridges phase, I'd give them a six or a seven. They actually were asking the right questions, um, and say they got judged poorly. The Todd Muller phase, I'd give them about a one. Through that whole period, they were just missing in action. And with the Judith Collins phase, I'd give them a six or a seven. They've had some wobbles, but they're starting to propose positive alternatives and ask good questions. So I'd give them a six, maybe a seven on a good day.
Okay, and on that note, shall I ask how would you like to rate what ACT is doing so far? Would you like to improvise on what you're already doing, and where do you rate yourself right now?
Look, I'd never rate myself because it's up to the voters to decide. But what I'd like to say to the India Weekend audience is that every other party wants to take your money and bribe you with it to re-elect them. They want to make rules endlessly to solve every problem, and every rule they make restrains your freedom. ACT, on the other hand, is for people who are independent self-starters who want to make a difference in their own lives and the lives those they care about, not to be fodder for politicians and their grand government schemes. And if that sounds like you, then maybe ACT is your party, and I hope you'll give your party vote to ACT to change your future.
Well, that's a very good elevator pitch, but I'm not letting you go straight off now. I want to know more about your views on the importance of migrant workers in New Zealand economy. And so, do you think that this government has treated migrant workers fairly?
I think that first of all, before COVID and then after COVID, so there's sort of two parts to this. ACT has always been in favour of immigration. We believe it enriches New Zealand. We believe it's not viable for New Zealand to operate with a labour market that's effectively only 5 million people. I certainly think that some of the visas that have been issued that don't have a clear path to citizenship and make a person dependent on a single employer are open to abuse. So that really worries me. I don't think you should ever be dependent on a single employer. And I think that you should always have a pathway to citizenship. Those are some principles for migration. In the post COVID period, I think, in fairness to the government, they've faced very challenging difficulties. You've got a large number of people stranded in New Zealand who are not citizens or permanent residents in a job market that's contracting, particularly in the areas of hospitality and tourism that have employed so many migrant workers. And so I do think, given those people are stuck here, that we've got an obligation to give some support. But it is a difficult situation when people who wouldn't normally be entitled for benefits are stuck here. So I'm not going to beat the government up about that. I do think generally we need to be pro immigration, welcome people who add value to our country, and then be prepared to tweak some of the rules about dependency on one employer, paths to citizenship, and so on.
Great, thanks for that answer. Now, one of the most compelling issues that this government have faced, I do understand that you have been quite understanding of government's position as well. Uh, Basically, about around 10,000 temporary migrants who were ordinarily resident in this country. They are currently stranded out overseas. The borders are closed. It has been more than 5 to 6 months. So, supposedly, you come to government after October, along with your national party, your allies. What would be your support for getting those 10,000 odd temporary migrant workers back into the country?
Well, I think you've got to start with some humanity. So I've got people in the Epsom electorate that I've tried to help with this government who may have been going to school in New Zealand for several years, and they're now stranded, unable to come back, stranded in places like Bali. Not their fault, they were there for a week and now can't return. So, first of all, you've got to start with some humanity. What connections do people have? I think if they have children that were attending school, they should be able to return. I think if they have a job that they were performing for a period of time, let's say more than a year, then they should be able to return. I think if they have other family connections, we should factor that in. So, first of all, it's never going to be a free for all, but let's start considering some human factors. That should be how we decide if people can return. The second thing I'd say, sorry, you go.
No, no,
The
you got,
second,
you know.
it's pointless making a law letting people come back if we don't actually have the capacity for them to enter the country. So right now we have about 4,000 isolation units, and we have to keep people there for 14 days. So you do the maths. That's only 300 or 400 people a day can actually come in, and this is why I talk about government being a referee, not a player. We've got to get so good at our testing and tracing and monitoring of isolation that actually we can start having people isolating in a private facility, because there's a lot of people who are prepared to pay or have the means to isolate outside of the government system, but the government has no way of monitoring them or making sure that they're actually doing it. So, the problem for those migrant workers is if you've got an overflow of New Zealand passport holders trying to come back, you can only get 300 or 400 people through each day. Those migrant workers will never get in. So that's why that first thing I said about the role of government as a referee, not a player, and allowing more private enterprise rather than state control is really important.
Sure, that makes sense. And well, you have quite well said that, raised those issues and planned how government can actually get those temporary migrant workers currently stranded overseas by coming up with a good strategy. You have pointed quite nicely about the capacity issues, which a lot of migrant workers who are currently stranded overseas, they fail to understand that why government is not building up new capacities, since COVID is going to stay with us for quite some time, and the people who are being forcefully um, be out of New Zealand. They had a life over here, living for at least many years, if not decades, and they have an expectation that they would be allowed to come back. So government should be working in that capacity space as well. But again, probably we will have to leave that for another day, which I believe we will talk again before your elections. One last question before I let you go, David, for today. Supposedly. Auckland comes out of wood next Monday, and we are again into level two. And remain there for considerable time, along with the rest of New Zealand, with the new settings of just around the restrictions on the mass gathering to be around 10. So, how do you think it's going to affect campaigning? Have you made some preparation or calculations on those lines, or?
Yeah, look, I mean, just as lots of people running their businesses and their households and just trying to run their lives are disturbed by the restrictions and the uncertainty about the restrictions, our campaign has been restricted too. And this is quite troubling because I want to get out and do street corner meetings. On Sunday, I was supposed to do 11 street corner meetings where I go out and stand on the corner and listen to the neighborhood's views. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to do that. That's been cancelled for the last two weekends and will be cancelled this weekend as well. That's just one little example. But the ACT Party will be getting out with our bus. Our bus tour will go ahead. We're going to do lots of meetings. We're going to listen to lots of people. And we're going to have a really great campaign. It's just we're facing a bit of uncertainty about the government restrictions like everybody else is.
Great. Okay, so we look forward to catch you in one of those street corner meetings, if not in the studio soon. And thanks for your time today, David. We really appreciate you taking that time out of your busy schedule out there in Wellington Parliament. And before I let you go, one final call, or rather request: why should Kiwi Indian voters be voting for ACT Party?
Look, the ACT Party is the party for the self starters, the independent thinkers, and people who want to make a difference in their own lives and the lives of those that they care about. We're not people who want to be fodder for politicians and their grand government schemes. Remember, when the government promises you money, it's taxing it off you. And if you vote for that, you're incredibly gullible. We're in favour of people keeping more of their own money. We're in favour of the simple idea that if you're not harming anyone else, you can live as you see fit. Those are our principles. And if you sound like the kind of person who wants to make that difference in their own lives and those of those that of those that you care about, then there's a good chance that ACT is your party, and you might like to consider giving your party vote to ACT to change your future.
Great. Thanks for your message, David. And I will leave that for our audiences to decide which way they want to go, or they want to hear you again more often. So, but anyways, thanks for your time today, David. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Bye.